For thousands of years, human civilizations have whispered about the underworld, not the Christian hell of fire and damnation, but something far older and infinitely more terrifying. These are the stories of the gods who rule over death itself, the untold, darkest truths about the deities who command the realm of the dead, and the horrifying rules they enforce. Welcome to the deep investigation into humanity's oldest and most sinister mythology. In ancient Mesopotamia, there existed a goddess whose name alone could freeze blood. Ereshkigal. She was not a demon. She was not a fallen angel. She was something far worse. She was the absolute sovereign of the Sumerian underworld. Her domain operated under laws so brutal that even other gods feared her wrath. According to the ancient texts, Ereshkigal did not choose her position. She was essentially kidnapped and forced into darkness, married off to the underworld's king Nergal, against her will. This was not mythology's romantic tale. This was imprisonment. This was cruelty institutionalized by divine decree. But here's how Ereshkigal's kingdom operated with absolute bureaucratic precision. Every soul that entered her domain could never leave. Now the true crime unfolds. Not through negotiation, not through prayer, not through any conceivable means. The ancient texts describe judges who would examine each soul, determine their deeds, and render eternal judgment. There were no appeals. There were no second chances. The underworld was not rehabilitation. It was permanent incarceration, managed by a vengeful queen who grew increasingly bitter about her own cosmic imprisonment. In Greek mythology, we encounter a figure equally terrifying, Hades. Unlike popular modern depictions, Hades was not evil incarnate. He was something worse. He was efficient, cold, completely indifferent to human suffering. Hades ruled the underworld with the same detached authority as a prison warden who has stopped seeing inmates as people. The ancient Greeks understood something crucial about Hades that we have largely forgotten. He was not cruel because he enjoyed cruelty. He was cruel because emotion was irrelevant to his function. He had a job. That job was to hold the dead. But the Greeks added another layer of horror to this mythology. They created the concept of psychopomps. These were supernatural entities whose sole purpose was to guide souls from the world of the living into the domain of the dead. Charon, Hermes. These figures were not saviors. They were enforcers. They were the mechanisms through which the underworld maintained its absolute power over humanity. You could not negotiate with a psychopomp. You could not bargain with them. They operated under rules established by Hades himself, and those rules were absolute. The most terrifying aspect of Greek underworld mythology, this was not merely a geographical feature. This river functioned as the final barrier between life and death. Once you crossed it, your identity as a living being was permanently erased. The ancient Greeks understood the psychological horror of this concept. You could be mourned, you could be remembered, but you could never, under any circumstances, return. The underworld was not the afterlife as we typically understand it. It was permanent exile from existence as the living knew it. Now we turn to Norse mythology, where we encounter a figure equally chilling. Hel, daughter of Loki, ruler of Niflheim. Hel's domain was called Helheim, and it operated under a logic that made even the Norse gods uncomfortable. Unlike other underworld deities, Hel did not judge souls based on morality. She did not care about your deeds. She did not care about your character. She simply received the dead, all of them, indiscriminately. This created a particular kind of horror in Norse thought. You could live an honorable life, die bravely, and still end up in Hel's domain. Your fate was not determined by your choices. It was determined by how you died. But the true crime element of Norse underworld mythology emerges when we examine Hel's relationship with the other gods. When Balder, the most beloved god in the Norse pantheon, was killed, all of the gods and goddesses begged Hel to return him to life. This was perhaps the most significant negotiation in all of Norse mythology, and Hel refused. She would only release Balder if every living thing in creation wept for him. This was not a simple condition. This was a test designed to fail, because Loki, Hel's father, deliberately refused to weep. One being's refusal meant Balder would remain imprisoned in Hel's domain forever. the Underworld goddess had essentially orchestrated a permanent imprisonment using the emotions of the living as her enforcement mechanism. Across all of these mythological traditions, we find a consistent pattern. The Underworld is not a punishment for the wicked. It is a prison for everyone. The rulers of these realms operate outside the jurisdiction of morality. They enforce rules that predate human understanding, and they answer to no authority except themselves. This is the terrifying truth that ancient civilizations tried to communicate through mythology. Death is not negotiable. The Underworld is not a place you can escape, and the entities that rule these realms do not care about your individual story. The psychopomps deserve particular examination in this context. These were not malevolent figures, but they were enforcement mechanisms. In Egyptian mythology, Anubis served as the guardian of the dead and guide of souls. In Greek mythology, Charon demanded payment for passage across the Styx. In every case, the psychopomp was not an advisor or counselor. They were operatives who ensured that the Underworld maintained control over death itself. They were the infrastructure through which mortality was enforced. What makes this mythology so terrifying is that it reflects a fundamental human truth. Death is absolute. It is not something you can negotiate with. It is not something you can understand through logic or reason. The ancient civilizations that created these myths understood that the Underworld could not be conquered or appealed to. The only relationship you could have with the Underworld was submission, complete and total surrender to forces that operated on an entirely different level of existence. Ereshkigal, Hades, Hell, and all the psychopomps that served them represented a cosmic law enforcement system that predated human law. These were not myths created to comfort people about death. These were dark warnings about the absolute nature of mortality.
If you like mythology, like and subscribe.